All right, my name is Joseph Suglia, and I'm going to be reading my English translation of Friedrich Nietzsche's Beyond Good and Evil. In German, Jenseits von Gut und Böse von Friedrich Nietzsche. This is part 2 in my video series. If you haven't yet seen it, please watch part 1. It's over there, or maybe over there. I don't know. Let me also make an announcement. So I will be reading my translation, which in all modesty, I think is the only readable translation, the only accurate translation of Jenseits von Gut und Böse into English. I know there are many English translations of this book, but in many places they are unreadable, they are illegible, and they are unintelligible and wrong. But what I wanted to say is, from time to time, I will comment. So this is a translation reading / lecture. I don't know what I will say, and I think that might be the fun in watching this and in performing this, because I have no idea what I'm doing. I'm going to be extemporizing. From time to time, I'll insert my commentary. We'll just see how it goes. So I already read the preface to Beyond Good and Evil, and now I'm going to be reading from the first section, entitled On the Prejudices of Philosophers. Paragraph 1. The will to truth still entices us to so many risks. That famed truthfulness of which all philosophers hitherto have spoken with reverence. How many questions has this will to truth laid before us? What wondrous, terrible, questionable questions. That is already a long story. And yet it does not seem to us that this story, has scarcely begun? What wonder then that we have already grown mistrustful? What wonder that we have already lost patience? What wonder that we have already turned impatiently away from the truth? For that reason, we should, on our side, learn questioning from this Sphinx. Who is it, actually, who here poses questions to us? What is it actually in us that wills the truth? In fact, we have hesitated for a long time before the question of the origin of this will, until we ultimately stood frozen before an even more fundamental question. What asked about the value of this will? Which asked about the value of this will? Granted, we want the truth, but why not rather untruth? What about uncertainty? Even ignorance? The problem of the value of truth comes before us, or was it us who came before this problem? Who among here is Oedipus? Who is the Sphinx? It is a rendezvous, so it seems, of questions and question marks. And would one ever believe that we were the first who raised this question? That we were the first to see this question, the first to fasten it in our gaze, the first to risk it? For there is a risk inherent to this question, and perhaps there is no greater one. Number 2, paragraph number 2. How could something originate from its opposite? For instance, truth from error, or the will to truth from the will to deception, or selfless action from selfishness, or the pure sunny view of essences from lustfulness? Such origination is impossible, they say. Who would ever dream of such thing? Who would ever dream of such thing is a fool. No, even worse. Things of the highest worth must have another origin, their own origin. They must not have come from this ephemeral, seductive, deceptive, paltry world. They cannot be derivable from this chaos of delusion and desire. No, rather from the womb of being, from the impermanent, from the concealed God, from the thing in itself. From there they must have come, and from nowhere else. End of quotation. This kind of judging constitutes the typical prejudice that allows us to recognize metaphysicians of every epoch. This kind of evaluation stands in the background of all logical procedures. From this belief comes all of their efforts at knowledge, in quotation marks. From this belief comes all of their efforts to solemnly christen something as the truth, in quotation marks. The fundamental belief of metaphysicians is the faith in oppositions of value. It has never dawned on even the most careful among them to start doubting right at the threshold, right where it is needed the most, even though they have praised one another for their de omnibus dubitandum, the doubting of everything. To be precise, one should doubt, first of all, if oppositions exist at all. And secondly, one should wonder if such folkish evaluations, such populist evaluations, and oppositions of value upon which metaphysicians have imprinted their seal of approval might not only be foreground appraisals, superficial appraisals, they are perhaps merely provisional perspectives. Provisional perspectives. Perhaps they have only been looked at from around the corner or from below, from the perspective of a frog, to borrow an expression with which painters are familiar. Whatever value one might attribute to the truth, to truthfulness, to selflessness, perhaps it would be possible to even grant an even more fundamental value to appearance, to the will to deception, to selfishness, and to desire. It might even be possible that what constitutes the value of those good and honorable things is an insidious connection to those bad things to which they seem opposed. Perhaps they are related, knotted together, hooked, perhaps even essentially the same. Perhaps. But who today is willing to concern oneself with such a dangerous perhaps? One is already waiting for the arrival of a new species of philosophers, such who have an entirely different taste and tendency as the previous philosophers. Philosophers of the dangerous perhaps in every respect. And to speak in all seriousness, I see such new philosophers coming up. I will comment on this a bit later. I really want to read a bit more. There is a presupposition behind this argument, and we haven't gotten there yet. So I want to get to that premise, that presupposition, before I comment. I do encourage you to watch part 1 of this lecture series, lecture/translation series. If you have not yet done so, because in the last 10 minutes, the last 15 minutes of that video, I kind of make clear where all of this is going. Paragraph 3. After I observe philosophers long enough, reading between the lines, I say to myself, one must ascribe the majority of conscious thinking to instinctive activity. And even in the case of philosophical thinking, one has to relearn the concept of conscious thinking as one relearned the concepts of hereditary, of heredity, of the hereditary, and, in quotation marks, the congenital. In the same way as birth has little to do with the entire proto-process and the procedure of heredity. Let me read that again. In the same way as birth has little to do with the entire proto-process and procedure of heredity, just as little is consciousness, in quotation marks, opposed to the instinctive in any decisive sense. The majority of conscious thinking is secretly led by the instincts and forced down determinate pathways. Even behind all logic and its ostensible self-mastery of movement lie evaluations. Spoken more clearly, physiological demands for the preservation of a determinate form of life. For example, the idea that the determinate is worth more than the indeterminate, that appearance is worth more, let me say it again. For example, the idea that the determinate is worth more than the indeterminate, that appearance is worth less than the truth, in quotation marks, such evaluations, for all their regulative importance for us, could be mere foreground evaluations, just superficial evaluations. A specific kind of nihilism, that means foolishness, silliness. Nihilism, which necessitates the preservation of beings. This presupposes, of course, that human beings are not the measure of all things. Let me pause over this, because this is the basis of Nietzsche's argument right here. This is the presupposition of all that we've heard so far. Nietzsche is saying, in essence, that the human animal is inaccessible to itself, that the core of the human being, the human animal, is unknown to that animal. The essence of the human being, the human animal, is opaque to itself. We don't know ourselves. We are strangers to ourselves, to quote Nietzsche in Toward the Genealogy of Morals. We are strangers to ourselves. That is to say, consciousness is nothing more than a thin membrane. It's like an iridescent membrane on the surface of unconscious. It's a film on the surface, a pellicle on the surface of the unconscious mind. So consciousness is a membranous film on the surface of the unconscious mind. We are, as it were, astride tigers. We are riding on the backs of tigers, which are the whole, the totality of the unconscious mind. Everything that we do, everything that we say, everything that we think bubbles up from the unconscious mind. All of conscious activity is explicable and derivative from the unconscious mind. Now, if that's the case, and surely it is, and all of psychoanalysis and Freud come from this passage, by the way. Freud, I mean, this is an academic point, but Freud read Nietzsche. Freud adulated Nietzsche. All of psychoanalysis, all of Freudian psychoanalysis, and modern psychology comes from Nietzsche. Of course, they would commit patricide. They would want to deny the ultimate intellectual, conceptual source of their theories. Of course they would. But if human beings are primarily unconscious beings, then they practice a kind of self-misknowledge. The Delphic injunction, know thyself, know yourself, is based on a fallacious assumption. We cannot know ourselves. There is only the possibility of self-misknowledge, not self-knowledge. There really is no such thing as self-consciousness. Self-consciousness is hetero-consciousness. In other words, self-consciousness is the consciousness of the stranger, the consciousness of the foreigner, an alien consciousness, an anonymous, impersonal consciousness. Now, if this is true, and surely it is, what does this say about us and our self-evaluations, our self-assessments, our self-understandings, our self-interpretations? What does it say? It means that every self-interpretation that we set forward is a false interpretation, is an erroneous, fallacious interpretation, and should be regarded as such. So take, for example, I'm sure you've met people like this. Let's bring it down to earth. I know I was getting a bit airy there, a bit lofty. Let's bring it down to earth. We've all met people who tell us how nice they are. We've all met people who tell us how empathic they are, how compassionate they are. Well, Nietzsche would say, and I don't really like that game, the philosopher would say this, the thinker would say this, we don't really know. He's been dead for a long time. He died 120 years ago. And I don't really want to speak on behalf of Nietzsche, but what Nietzsche has said, what Nietzsche has written, and I'm just paraphrasing at this point, is that altruism, for example, other-centeredness, selflessness is a myth. Of course it's a myth, but altruism, understood in the absolute sense, is based in egoism, although I don't like that word, like selfishness, self-centeredness. Altruism, volunteerism, other-directedness, empathy, compassion, all of these things are rooted in an aggressive self-assertiveness of one's own superiority, the desire for one's own superiority, this vaunting desire to be superior to others, the desire to assert one's strength in opposition to the weak. And so Nietzsche questions empathy and compassion and altruism, at least in the absolute sense. In a relative sense, these things do exist. But so what he's doing is he's taking these lofty ideals and he's dragging them down into the mud of the human, all too human world. He's saying, your ideals, you think that they're pure, you think they're autogeneously produced. Autogeny means self-productive, self-producing. You think that your ideals, your values, come from a pure place. They have a pure origin. Again, they're autogeneously produced. You think that. You metaphysicians, you dogmatists, you believe that. No, no. They all come from the slime and the mud and the muck, the mire, the quag of human experience, of the human, all too human world. So someone who claims to be a loving person is not so loving as one thinks, because as Nietzsche writes elsewhere in Also sprach Zarathustra, I'm just paraphrasing and translating this, this part. Love is really the desire for appropriation. Love is the desire for assimilation and control. The desire for possession, the desire to own another human being. Is he wrong about this? And maybe if we were to be honest about emotions and our own human psychology, we would stop deceiving ourselves as much as we can. But as Nietzsche points out, we are self-deceptive creatures. If most thinking is unconscious activity. If the overwhelming majority of intellectual activity is unconscious, the human animal is a self-deceptive, deluded creature. The human animal is the mendacious organism, the creature that lies to itself all of the time. So love is not pure, and why would love be a value? By the way, I'm in the coming months, I'm going to be writing an essay on Shakespeare's Antony and Cleopatra, and it will be written from this perspective. I think I might change my mind, but so what Nietzsche is saying is it seems shocking at first, but he's reducing good to evil. This does not make him a philosopher of evil. He's not a philosopher of evil. He doesn't really believe in good or evil. So good and evil should be put into quotation marks, as annoying as that is. So he's saying that what culture calls good is reducible to what culture calls evil, right? So good is evil. That doesn't mean he's some, devilish philosopher. As he's twisting his Vercingetorix mustache, he's like, make evil my good, like Mephistopheles or something. No, he's not that. He's not Machiavelli. He's not even Timon. If you know the famous misanthrope Timon, I highly recommend Shakespeare's tragedy, Timon of Athens, if you've not yet read it. Arguably one of Shakespeare's 10 greatest plays. It's very underestimated, but anyway, I digress. But so what am I really saying? Well, what I'm saying is good doesn't exist according to Nietzsche. Evil doesn't exist according to Nietzsche. So he's not a philosopher of evil, not at all. He doesn't really believe that these abstractions exist. He thinks that good is an abstraction. He thinks that evil is an abstraction, and both of these abstractions are mystifications. They're lies, they're myths. And humanity really would be better without them. And once we slough off these old, antiquated, fake concepts, human beings, humanity, humankind would rise to its full height, to its fullest height, to its zenith, to its great noon. Now that is what Nietzsche calls der Übermensch, over humanity, as I translate it. If I may make a self-recommendation, I strongly recommend reading my essay on So sprach Zarathustra and Jordan Peterson, who misunderstands Nietzsche. That's on my WordPress site. Well, I have 3, but it's drjosephsuglia.wordpress.com. So I would read that essay on So sprach Zarathustra, and also there's a section on Jordan Peterson's misinterpretation of Nietzsche. Anyway, let me get back to this. By the way, I forgot to say my name, which I should have done. My name is Joseph Suglia, Josephsuglia. Anyway, so paragraph 4. The falsity of a judgment is for us no objection to a judgment. This is the place in which our new language perhaps sounds the strangest. The question is, to what extent is it life-promoting, life-sustaining, species-sustaining, perhaps even species-breeding? Excuse me. And we are perhaps fundamentally inclined to maintain that the falsest judgments, to which synthetic a priori judgments belong, are the most indispensable. That without the validation of logical fictions, without measuring reality against the wholly invented world, of unconditioned and self-identical, without the constant falsification of the world through numbers, people could not live. The renunciation of false judgments would be a renunciation of life, a negation of life. To admit untruth as a condition of life, this clearly means resisting the usual value feelings in a dangerous manner. And a philosophy which takes such a risk thereby goes beyond good and evil. I don't know if I need to comment on this very much. I mean, this is an amazing passage, and I'm sure that logicians and analytic philosophers and most Anglo-American philosophers were blithely dismissive of this passage, because what Nietzsche is saying is amazingly shattering. He's saying that mathematics is a transcendental operation, which it is. It's not, as Kant believed, an analytic a priori. Logic is a transcendental operation. What he's saying is that these are just human systems of thought, and they have nothing to do with reality, and they have nothing to do with life. But then Nietzsche, I love this argument. Nietzsche is not asking a question such as, is this statement true? Is this logical proposition true? Is this metaphysical claim true? He's not asking that question. He's asking, what is the value, if any, of this proposition for life? So in other words, maybe it's necessary to believe all of this junk in order for the human species to live. Maybe there's an evolutionary value to believe in logic and in mathematics and in logical philosophy. Perhaps human beings need these lies, these fictions, in order to live. So are logical statements evolutionarily necessary? I can't think of a more radical thing to say about logic than that. Radical in the etymological sense of the word radical, which means to go to the radix, the root, the basis. Oh, this is great. This is great stuff, isn't it? Paragraph 5. What provokes us into regarding all philosophers, half with mistrust and half with mockery, is not that we constantly find out how innocent they are, how naive. Remember the preface. I'll shut up and keep on reading. How often and how easily they mess up and go astray. In short, their childishness and childlikeness. Rather, what provokes our mistrust and mockery is that there is not enough honesty in them. Even though they make loud and virtuous noises when the problem of truthfulness is even remotely touched upon. They all act as though they discovered and arrived at their own opinions through the self-development of a cold, pure, divinely insouciant dialectics, in contrast with mystics of every stripe, who are more forthright and more foolish than they are. The mystics talk of, in quotations, inspiration, while in fact what happens is that the philosophers take a proposition that has been accepted in advance, a sudden impression, and inspiration, in quotation marks. At most an abstracted and sifted through wish of the heart that is then defended with rationalizations sought after the fact. All of them are advocates who do not want to be known as such, and indeed cunning endorsers of their prejudices. So all of them are advocates of their prejudices. All of the philosophers are advocates of their own uncritically accepted irrational prejudices. Sorry, that's my commentary. And indeed, these philosophers are cunning endorsers of their prejudices, which they christen as truths, in quotation marks, and are very far away from the bravery of conscience that would admit this fact, this very fact, far from the good taste of bravery, which would let friend or enemy know about this trickery, which would warn friend or enemy of this trickery, whether it be from exuberance or from self-deprecation. By the way, exuberance there is Schwärmerei in the German, which is a word that's notoriously difficult to translate. The Tartuffery of old Kant, a Tartuffery which is as stiff as it is prudish, who entices us down dialectical detours, side roads that lead to his, in quotes, categorical imperative, or rather that lead us astray to his, in quotes, categorical imperative, seduce us, lead us astray. This spectacle makes us smile. We who are so indulgent, we who find no small amusement in spying on the subtle tricks of the old moralists and preachers of morals, or even that hocus pocus of mathematical formulae with which Spinoza armed and masked, as if with ore, his philosophy, which would be better termed, quote, his love of wisdom. Get it? Philosophy, love of wisdom. No, it's his love of wisdom, Spinoza's love of wisdom. And thus from the beginning intimidate any assailants who would dare cast a glance at this unconquerable virgin and Pallas Athena. How much timidity and vulnerability are revealed by this masquerade of the reclusive invalid. Now, I'm going to be talking about this passage later on. When we finally get to Nietzsche's famous aphorism, one of the most famous things he ever wrote, and all of us have heard this aphorism even before having read Nietzsche, or even without having read Nietzsche. Everyone knows this. You know, the quotation of, when you look into the abyss looks into you. When I finally get around to reading that aphorism and my translation of that aphorism, I will return to this passage, but not now. Not now. It's too soon. It's premature. But I believe, in my heart of hearts, that this passage is the perfect context in which to interpret that famous aphorism about the abyss looking into you. When you look into the abyss looks into you. I don't want to talk about why that is now, but we will get there if you stick with me, which I hope you will. Because what else are we doing? If you're watching this video at the time at which I will have published it, we are all in quarantine right now because of the COVID-19 pandemic, this pestilence, what I call the planned disruptive plague. Anyway, I don't want to go on to another tangent, sorry. Paragraph 6, beyond good and evil. Gradually, the essence of every great philosophy hitherto was disclosed to me. To be precise, it was the self-confession of its creator, and a kind of involuntary and unnoticed memoir. All philosophy is a form of autobiography, is what he's saying. In brief, the moral, or in quotations, immoral intentions in every philosophy made up the actual life germ from which the entire plant had been germinated. In fact, it would be good and smart to provide an explanation of how the most hidden metaphysical claims of a philosophy originated. In order to do this, one must ask, which morality does he stem from? He is the philosopher. I would say he or she. Unfortunately, Nietzsche is always using the masculine pronouns. I wish he didn't. I accordingly do not believe that some, quotes, epistemological drive is the father of philosophy. Rather, there is another drive, here as elsewhere. Knowledge, misknowledge, is only an instrument that serves this deeper drive. But anyone who looks at the fundamental drives of human beings, insofar as they play the game of pretending to be inspiring geniuses or demons and kobolds, will soon find out that they have all done philosophy at one time or another. Any one of these would be too pleased to present itself as the ultimate purpose of existence and as the rightful master of all of the other drives. The drive to philosophize, he's saying, is just one drive among other drives, right? For each drive is thirsty for mastery, and as such tries out philosophizing. All the drives try out philosophizing. Indeed, among scholars, the truly scientific people, It might stand otherwise better if one likes. There might really be something like an epistemological drive, some kind of trifling autonomous clockwork, which, well wound, bravely does its work without the remaining drives of the scholar, essentially being involved. The genuine interests of the scholar reside there somewhere entirely different, whether in the family or the acquisition of money or in politics. Oh my goodness, is he really saying here, I'm sorry, this is commentary, is he saying that philosophers care more about money and their families than they do about philosophy? Oh no, is that what he's saying? I mean, we mustn't admit that. No, he couldn't be. He couldn't be saying that, right? No. He couldn't be saying that philosophers care more and professors of philosophy care more about personal concerns than about philosophy. Well, if he is saying that, and I hope he's not, he's very close to Schopenhauer. Although Nietzsche takes a distance from his former teacher, his unofficial teacher, Schopenhauer. Every now and then in this book, you'll hear resonances of Schopenhauer's unofficial teacher, Schopenhauer. Wait, did I say? No, Nietzsche, sorry. Every now and then in this book, you'll hear echoes from Nietzsche's unofficial teacher, Schopenhauer. Sorry. Let me get back to this, though. Indeed, it is almost a matter of indifference whether his little machine is installed at this place within science or someplace else. And it is a matter of indifference whether the promising young worker makes a philologist or a fungus connoisseur or a chemist out of himself. Is he saying there's no predestination to the business of philosophy? Is that what he's saying? No. So he's saying that philosophers are not pre-programmed to do philosophy? Is he really saying that philosophers are not congenitally philosophical, that they're not born to be philosophers? No. No. None of these things characterize him. Again, sorry about the masculine pronouns. Whether he becomes this or that, I'll say he or she becomes this or that. Rather, there's nothing impersonal about the philosopher. It is the case that his or her morality gives a decisive and determining testimony of who he or she is. That is, his or her morality testifies to the hierarchy in which the innermost drives of his or her nature are arranged. Wow. So let's continue. I'm going to keep on going until I drop from exhaustion. I'll just keep on going. Paragraph 7. How malicious philosophers can be. I know nothing more venomous than the joke in which Epicurus indulged against Plato and the Platonists. He called them Dionyso. This is Greek. Sorry, I don't know Greek. Dionysio Kolakes. I'm going with that. That means literally and on the surface, flatterer of Dionysus, and thus tyrant retinue and toady. I could also have translated that stooge. But above all, he wants to say that all of them are actors. There is nothing authentic about them. There's nothing genuine about them. For Dionysokolaks was a popular designation for actors. And that last part was the true maliciousness which Epicurus shot at Plato. He was exasperated by the bombastic mannerisms, the mise en scène that Plato and his students were so skilled at, which Epicurus was not skilled at. He, the old schoolmaster from Samos, who sat hidden in his little Athenian garden and who wrote 300 books. Who knows why? Perhaps out of rage and emulousness toward Plato? It took 100 years before Greece found out who this garden god Epicurus was. Did it ever find out? I'm going to pause for just a second. And so we are back. I like the afternoon of spending my Tuesday afternoon reading Nietzsche in my English translation. So let me continue. Paragraph 8. In every philosophy, there is a point at which the conviction, in quotation marks, of the philosopher steps on stage, or to say it in the language of the ancient mysteries, adventavit asinus pulcher e fortissimus. Paragraph 9. You want to live, in quotes, in accordance with nature? Oh, you noble Stoics, what a chicanery of words. Think of the essence that nature is, measurelessly wasteful, measurelessly indifferent, without purpose or care, without mercy or justice, fruitful and at the same time barren and uncertain. Excuse me. Think of the indifference of nature itself as power. How could you live according to this indifference? Nature is indifferent, you say. He's talking about the measureless indifference of nature. If you haven't yet seen it, I highly recommend a film by Werner Herzog called Grizzly Man. And I think that, that Werner Herzog is certainly well-versed in German literature. We know that. He knows German literature better than most people. I see references to German literature all over his work, but also German philosophy. In fact, I believe he studied philosophy briefly before dropping out of school, I think. Sorry. But if you watch the film Grizzly Man, you'll get a sense of just how there's a man named Timothy Treadwell who tries to humanize bears. He actually goes out into the wild and plays with grizzly bears. Not a good idea. And if you know what happened to Timothy Treadwell and his girlfriend, it's very sad. He was in fact mauled and devoured by grizzly bears, I'm sorry to say, as was his girlfriend. I'm sorry to say that, but it's true. But Treadwell really seemed to think that grizzly bears were human beings in bear costumes. And he humanized the bears. He even anthropomorphized the bears. He thought that the bears were therianthropes. A therianthrope is a human being who transforms into a non-human animal. Maybe you could say that he thought that bears were zoomorphs. A zoomorph is a human being in the shape of a non-human animal. An imbestial animal. I invented that word, imbestial. I hope you like it. INBESTIAL. I should try to trademark that. Anyway, think of the indifference that nature is, measurelessly wasteful, measurelessly indifferent, without purpose or care, without mercy or justice, fruitful and at the same time barren and uncertain. Think of the indifference of nature itself as a power. How could you live according to this indifference? Life. Is that not a wanting to be otherwise, as nature is? Is life not an evaluating, a preferring, a being unjust, a being limited, a wanting to be different? And suppose that your imperative to live according to nature meant in essence as much as living according to life. How could you do otherwise? What is the reason for making a principle out of which what you are yourselves and what you cannot help but be? In truth, things are entirely different. Even though you rapturously pretend to read the canon of your law and nature, it is the exact opposite. You wonder-worthy actors and self-deceivers. Your pride wants to prescribe your morality, your ideal to nature, and to incarnate your ideal in nature itself. So all of these people who see justice and order in nature, like this is, if you've studied law, you know about the natural law argument. Anyone who thinks that nature is just or fair or organized or pre-stabilized, pre-organized, all these people are doing is they're exporting their own ideas of nature and they're importing them into nature. And they're projecting, really. They're transferring their own human, all too human concepts of order, logic, justice, decency, goodness, what have you, onto nature, onto they're projecting these ideals onto the screen of nature, which is a blank screen. It's an indifferent screen. So that was me, if you couldn't tell. So Nietzsche goes on, your pride wants to prescribe your morality, your ideal to nature, and to incarnate your ideal in nature, nature itself. You demand that nature exist according to the Stoa, in quotation marks. And you would like all of existence to be according to your own image, as the monstrous eternal glorification and generalization of Stoicism. Now here, this is a bit disappointing for me because I'm fascinated by Stoicism. The Stoics did indeed want to, as Nietzsche will point out later, they wanted to tyrannize nature. It's true. I mean, they really wanted to practice self-mastery, though. They wanted to tyrannize themselves, not nature or not anybody else. So the Stoics, as you probably know, wanted to control their emotions. Everybody knows that. But the real point of departure of Stoicism is actually distinguishing between what you can change and what you cannot change. Drawing a distinction, differentiating between the controllable and the uncontrollable. And it's a little disappointing for me that in this passage, Nietzsche so vigorously criticizes the Stoics. I love the Stoics, and I do see problems in their writings, but Nietzsche, as you'll see, lets no one off the hook. I'm sure you'll agree with me. He doesn't let anybody off the hook. Well, I'll get to this later, but Nietzsche doesn't even let the determinists off the hook, like those who don't believe in the free will and believe in necessity. He doesn't even let them off the hook, even though in a way he's a determinist himself. This is an explosive book, I have to say. I think it might be, no, I'm sure of it. This is the most explosive book that Nietzsche has ever written. And you even could describe it, I suppose, as an implosive book. It implodes as well as explodes. But anyway. Now he's talking about the Stoics. So with all of your love for truth, you have forced yourself for so long, so persistently, with such a hypnotic paralysis, to see nature in a false manner, namely in a stoical manner. And some abyssal arrogance gives you the madhouse hope that because you know how to tyrannize yourselves, Stoicism is self-tyranny. Nature, too, lets itself be tyrannized. Is the Stoic not, then, a piece of nature? But this is an old, eternal story. What happened with the Stoics is still happening today. As soon as philosophy begins to believe in itself, it always creates the world according to its own image. It cannot do otherwise. Philosophy is the tyrannical drive itself, the spiritual will to power. Philosophy is the tyrannical drive itself, the spiritual will to power. The will to the creation of the world, to the causa prima, the first cause. By the way, that word spiritual, my goodness. I'm not really comfortable with the word, but the word that Nietzsche uses is geistlich. And Geist in German means mind. It could mean spirit. It could also mean ghost, by the way. Those who have read Derrida know that very well. But sometimes I translate geistig or geistlich as spiritual, sometimes as intellectual. It really depends on the context. I'm not a big fan of that word. I've actually written about the word spiritual in my usage guide, if you're interested. All right, paragraph 10. The zeal and the subtlety, I almost want to say the slyness with which the problem of the, quote, real and apparent world has been taken up gives one much to think about and much to listen to. And whoever hears nothing more than a, quote, will to truth in the background does not possess the sharpest of ears. In certain rare cases, there might actually be such a will to truth, some sort of extravagant and adventurous bravery, the ambitiousness of a metaphysician to take part in a lost cause that will, in the end, prefer a handful of, quote, certainties to a whole wagon of lovely possibilities. There might even be puritanical fanatics of the conscience who would rather die for a certain nothingness than an uncertain something. And I capitalize the S in that. And Nietzsche, actually, in the German, he capitalizes the E in etwas, which means something. But this is nihilism, and the symptom of a despairing, deathly tired soul. No matter how bold the gestures of such a virtuousness might appear, among the stronger, more lifeful, life-thirsty thinkers, things stand much differently insofar as they campaign against appearance and utter the word perspectival only with contempt, insofar as they deprecate the believability of their own bodies as much as they deprecate the believability of phenomena, which says, the earth stands still, and so with seemingly good spirits relinquish their securest possession, for what does one believe in with greater certainty than one's own body? Who knows if they do not intend to reappropriate something that one once even more securely possessed, some kind of old belief from below, perhaps the, quote, immortal soul, or perhaps, quote, the old God. In short, ideas that make their lives a bit more endurable, ideas that made them stronger and more cheerful than the, in quotes, modern ideas. That was one long question. Now, I only want to pause over one piece of this. Now, Nietzsche is saying that the body is what we are aware of before all else. Now, if, God forbid, one is short of breath, if one is sick, and we're living in an age of sickness right now, we're struggling through an age of disease, an age of sickness, you're not really going to philosophize. You're going to be aware of your body before all else. One is aware of the body and the sensations and the appetites of the body before all else. The palpitations, the throbbings, the pulsings of the body come before abstract intellectual thought. Of course, everybody knows this. Nietzsche emphasizes the body in Also sprach Zarathustra, which is the book that he wrote and published right before this. Although he published part 4 after he published Beyond Good and Evil, part 4 of Also sprach Zarathustra. But anyway, when Nietzsche emphasizes the body, as he does in Also sprach Zarathustra and in this book, it really should be seen as a riposte to the German idealists. Now, if you've ever read the German idealists, my goodness, if you've ever read Hegel or Schelling, or even the transcendental idealism of Kant, but that's different. But if you've read the hardcore German idealists, Schelling and Hegel, you will know that these people write as if the body didn't even exist. And it is to the credit of Feuerbach, who was a young Hegelian who tried to revise Hegel, and Marx, who certainly was, in a sense, a Hegelian, that both of them acknowledged the body, as Nietzsche is doing here. Now, Feuerbach, he acknowledged the body. This is not well known, but the cliche, you are what you eat, came from Feuerbach. Feuerbach wrote at one point, Der Mensch ist, was der Mensch ist. Now, I know it sounds like he's saying the same thing, but to translate that into English, The human being is what the human being eats. And ist meaning is sounds like the German word for eats in the third person singular. But anyway, Nietzsche is acknowledging the body here, saying we're not minds that have bodies attached to them. No, the mind is propped on the plinth, the pillar of the body. So in other words, most of the human animal is physical, is corporeal, is bodily. And the mind is just super added onto that. It's not really a comfortable thought, because I didn't say this earlier, but human beings, as Nietzsche wrote earlier, want to see themselves as the measure of all things. How could human beings see themselves as the measure of all things? Why do we human beings think that we're superior to all other animals? I mean, even at the age of 26, Nietzsche knew this. He wrote an essay, Über Wahrheit und Lüge im außermoralischen Sinne, on truth and evil in the extra-moral sense. Highly recommended. Someday I will write about that and lecture on that. I haven't gotten around to that. But Nietzsche knew at a very early age that human beings are not the masters of the universe. They're not the masters of the planet Earth. When I utter the phrase masters of the universe, I don't think of the silly cartoon. I think of one of the greatest songs I've ever heard, which you should listen to, Master of the Universe by Hawkwind. Look it up. It's a great song. Anyway, I digress yet again. Sorry. It is this mistrust against modern ideas. It is the belief in all of that which was built yesterday and today. It is perhaps a frivolous exuberance, Schwärmerei, mixed with contempt that can no longer endure the bric-a-brac of concepts of various origins, which is how positivism advertises itself these days, a disgust by those of complacent tastes for the funfair chromatics and raggediness of all these realist philosophasters, for whom nothing is as new and as genuine as this colorfulness. That was very fun to translate, by the way. Here, I think, credit should be given to those skeptical anti-realists and epistemo-microscopists. Their instinct, which diverts them from modern reality, is unassailable. What do we care for their retrogressive detours? The essential thing is not that they want to regress, rather that they want to move away. A little more strength, motility, courage, artfulness, and they will want to go out and never come back. Now, I probably should talk a bit about Derrida. I know it's scandalous to say this, but Jacques Derrida is overrated. Derrida is overestimated. I mean, and believe me, I've spent 10 years of my life reading Derrida in English translation, but also in French. From the age of 18 to 28, I read Derrida. Now, I read many other things as well, but I read Derrida constantly. So I'm not coming from a place of ignorance. Now, it is true that I haven't read those texts for a while now. But I will say that there is nothing in Derrida that I cannot read in Beyond Good and Evil by Nietzsche. Derrida is a Franco-Nietzschean, and if I were to be unkind, which I don't want to be, I would say he is a philosophical mountebank, a circumlocutionist, and a philosophaster. Because all Derrida has said is that there is nothing pure, that all origins, all foundations, all logoi, if that's how you pronounce it, the plural of logos, logoi, I think that's how you pronounce it, are woven into the web of language. So every concept belongs to the network of language, the linguistic web. Derrida doesn't like the word language, though, in French or in English. because it has too much to do with speech. The word language is phonocentric. It seems to privilege the tongue, right? Lang means tongue, over writing. And that's why Derrida's word for language is writing. Écriture. Sorry, my pronunciation of French is not good at all. But I digress. But, you know, everything that you could read in Derrida, you could find in Nietzsche's Beyond Good and Evil. You can find in Wittgenstein, you know, Wittgenstein said famously, Die Grenzen meiner Sprache sind die Grenzen meiner Welt. The borders of my language are the borders of my world. You could also find much of Derrida and Blanchot, about whom I wrote my dissertation, about whose works I wrote my dissertation, partly. And also in Levinas, you know, the later Derrida wrote quite a bit about how every other is absolutely other. That came from Levinas. And the entire idea that language is a self-sufficient, autonomous, and impersonal network, and language is a space in which no one speaks and in which nothing is reflected. I'm just paraphrasing and translating Blanchot. And I have to say I know Blanchot very well, since I wrote my dissertation on him partly. Anyway, let me pause for a moment.